The bell above the cafe door jingled as a figure stepped inside, but no one looked up. Dressed in a tattered coat, his shoes worn down to the soles, and his hands trembling from the cold, the man shuffled toward the counter. His breath, thick with frost, vanished into the warmth of the cafe. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, but all he could think about was the piercing eyes now on him, the kind that made people feel like they didn't belong. Behind the counter, the young barista barely glanced at him before wrinkling his nose. "Sir, we don't give out free coffee," he said, his voice laced with irritation. The man didn't flinch. "I can pay," he said, pulling out a few crumpled bills from his pocket. The barista scoffed, eyeing the money like it was garbage. "Right. And I suppose you want our best roast too?" He turned to his coworkers with a smirk. "Maybe a croissant on the side?" A few customers chuckled, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Others turned away, pretending not to see what was happening. The homeless man stood there, silent. His fingers curled around his money, but he made no move to put it away. He wasn't ashamed, he had been through worse. But the barista wasn't done. He leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to sound like he was whispering, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look, I don't know where you came from, but this isn't some charity. People like you don't belong here. You're scaring away the real customers." Silence. The kind that made people freeze mid-bite. The homeless man studied the barista's face, not with anger, but with something deeper, pity. He finally spoke. "I hope you never find yourself in my place." Something about the way he said it sent a chill through the room. The barista rolled his eyes and waved him off. Yeah, whatever. Just get out." The man turned, stuffing his crumpled bills back into his pocket. As he walked toward the door, something unusual happened. A customer sitting by the window put down his coffee and stood up. He had been watching everything silently, and now, as the homeless man passed him, he reached into his coat and handed him something. It wasn't money. It was a business card. The homeless man glanced at it, confused. "Take it," the stranger said softly. "You might need it soon." The barista watched the exchange with an annoyed expression. He was too busy laughing with his coworkers to care. But he should have cared. Because the moment the homeless man stepped out into the cold, something shifted in the universe. The fall had begun. And the barista had no idea what was coming next. The barista barely thought about the encounter as he finished his shift. To him, the homeless man was just another nobody, a face he'd forget by tomorrow. "What a joke," he muttered as he wiped down the counter. "Did you see the way he acted? Like he actually belonged here." His coworkers laughed, shaking their heads. One of them smirked. "You should have seen the look on his face when you told him to leave." The barista grinned. "I did him a favor. A guy like that needs to accept reality, no one wants him around." The cafe owner, an older man with graying hair, overheard the conversation. His expression hardened. "Come to my office," he said sharply. The barista hesitated, but followed. Once inside, the owner leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "I heard everything." The barista shrugged. "So? I was just being honest. We don't need people like him scaring off customers." The owner's gaze darkened. "Is that so? And what if I told you I was once in his shoes?" The barista froze. "I lost everything once," the owner continued. "Had to sleep on benches, beg for food. Do you know who gave me my first chance? A cafe owner. Just like me." The barista shifted uncomfortably. "I don't run my business that way," the owner said firmly. "If you can't treat people with basic respect, you don't belong here." The barista opened his mouth to argue, but the words never came. "Go home," the owner said. "We'll talk about your future tomorrow." The barista stormed out, slamming his apron onto the counter. He didn't know it then, but this was only the beginning of his downfall. When he got home, his phone buzzed. A message from his landlord. "Your rent is past due. If you don't pay by next week, you'll have to leave." His stomach twisted. He had been spending money carelessly, assuming his job was secure. Frustrated, he tossed his phone onto the couch and sank into a chair. "I'll figure it out," he muttered. "It's just bad timing." But bad timing had only just begun. The next morning, he walked into the cafe, expecting to smooth things over. Instead, the owner was waiting at the door, his expression unreadable. "I've thought about it," he said. "We're letting you go." The barista's stomach dropped. "What? We can't have someone with your attitude representing this place." "But, it's final." Just like that, his world began to collapse. As he walked out of the cafe, jobless, something caught his eye. A business card. The one the homeless man had been handed the night before. It was still on the sidewalk, slightly crumpled. Curious, he picked it up and read the name. His heart skipped a beat. It belonged to someone powerful. Someone important. Someone who could change lives. The realization hit him hard. The homeless man wasn't just some guy. And the barista had made a terrible mistake. The barista stood on the sidewalk, staring at the business card. His hands tightened around the edges as his mind raced. The name printed in bold letters wasn't just familiar, it was legendary. A powerful businessman. A man who had built companies from the ground up. A man who could make or break someone's future. And he had handed his card to a homeless man. The barista's throat went dry. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the guy just picked it up from somewhere. But deep down, he knew the truth. The man he had mocked wasn't an ordinary beggar. He swallowed hard and shoved the card into his pocket. His heart pounded as he walked away, trying to convince himself it didn't matter. Back at his apartment, reality hit him like a punch to the gut. He had no job. No money coming in. Rent was due in a few days. And suddenly, the world didn't feel so secure anymore. His confidence, the arrogance he once carried so proudly, started to crack. For the first time in his life, he was afraid. That night, he sent out dozens of job applications. Each rejection felt like a slap. "We're not hiring at the moment. We've chosen another candidate. We don't think you're the right fit." The words blurred together. No one wanted him. He tossed his phone onto the table, running his hands through his hair. Why was this happening? Just days ago, he had been laughing, mocking a man who had nothing. And now? He was one step away from losing everything. Days passed. The landlord knocked. "You have 2 days left to pay." Desperation crept in. The barista went from coffee shops to fast food places, even grocery stores, begging for a job. Everywhere, the answer was the same. "Sorry, we're not hiring." It was as if the universe was punishing him. He wandered the streets, lost in thought, when he spotted something that made his stomach turn. A homeless shelter. People lined up outside, waiting for food, a warm place to sleep. He never thought he would see himself near a place like that. But now? Now, it didn't seem so far from reality. His pride fought against the idea, but something else whispered in his ear, "This is what happens when you think you're above others." As he turned to leave, a voice stopped him. "Didn't think I'd see you here." His heart nearly stopped. He turned slowly, and locked eyes with the homeless man he had mocked. The man stood there, calm, like he had been expecting this moment all along. And the barista had never felt smaller. The barista's throat tightened. Standing before him was the very man he had humiliated just days ago. But now, things had changed. The power dynamic had flipped. The barista was no longer the one looking down, he was the one struggling. His instincts told him to walk away, pretend he hadn't seen the man. But something held him there, frozen in place. The homeless man studied him for a moment before speaking. "Looks like life has humbled you." The words weren't harsh, but they cut deep. The barista swallowed, his pride screaming at him to deny everything. But he couldn't. Because standing there, broke and desperate, he realized something horrifying. He wasn't any different from the man in front of him. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own words, how he had mocked, laughed, and dismissed this man like he was worthless. Now, he was the one struggling to survive. He forced himself to speak. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "I lost my job." The homeless man nodded slowly. "And now, you're here." The barista hesitated. He didn't want to admit why he had come. But the truth was, he was running out of options. The homeless man motioned toward the shelter. "Come inside. It's cold out." The barista clenched his fists. His ego screamed at him to refuse. But his reality told him he had no choice. Without another word, he followed the man inside. The shelter smelled of old blankets and warm soup. The air was thick with exhaustion and quiet conversations. People huddled at tables, sharing food, stories, and silent struggles. The barista felt out of place. Just days ago, he had been the one serving people overpriced coffee in a trendy cafe. Now, he was one of them. A worker handed him a tray of soup and bread. He hesitated before taking it. He had never accepted a handout in his life. The homeless man watched him. "Hard, isn't it?" The barista's jaw clenched. "Yeah." The man sat across from him. "You get used to it." The barista stared at his food, his stomach growling. He had barely eaten in days. Finally, he gave in. As he ate, he listened to the quiet conversations around him, the stories of loss, betrayal, bad luck. A former teacher who had lost his job after an accident. A woman who had escaped an abusive home. A man who had once been wealthy, just like the barista, but had lost it all in a single moment. He had always thought homelessness was a choice. Now, sitting among them, he knew better. The homeless man spoke again. "Life has a funny way of teaching us things." The barista looked up, his mouth dry. "I didn't know." The man smiled slightly. "Now you do." The word sat heavy in his chest. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel above anyone. He just felt human. The barista sat at the worn-out table, his soup long gone, but his hunger for understanding had only just begun. For the first time, he listened, not just with his ears, but with his heart. The homeless man across from him spoke in a calm, steady voice. "People think we end up here because we're lazy. That we didn't try hard enough. But life doesn't work like that." The barista glanced around the shelter. The faces told stories, stories of bad luck, betrayal, tragedy. Not of failure. A middle-aged man sat near the corner, rubbing his hands together to stay warm. The homeless man gestured toward him. He was a construction worker. Broke his back on the job. His company refused to cover his medical bills. Lost his home trying to pay for surgery. The barista swallowed hard. A woman sat with a teenage boy, their heads close together as she whispered to him. She escaped an abusive husband, the homeless man continued. Had nowhere to go. Chose the streets over staying with a man who almost killed her. The barista's stomach twisted. He had spent his entire life believing people chose this life. That they just didn't try hard enough. Now, he saw the truth. No one wakes up wanting to be homeless. And yet, here they were. And now, so was he. That night, as he lay on a stiff cot in the shelter, sleep refused to come. His mind kept replaying the last few days, his arrogance, his mockery, the way he had laughed at the very people who had welcomed him today. He felt ashamed. But shame alone wouldn't fix anything. He had to change. The next morning, he woke up with a new determination. He had no money. No home. No job. But he had something else now, a chance to do better. And it started with swallowing his pride. That day, he took any work he could find. He cleaned tables in a diner for tips. He carried heavy boxes at a warehouse for a few bucks. The work was humbling, the kind he used to think was beneath him. Now, he was grateful for it. The homeless man watched his efforts but said nothing. Days turned into weeks. The barista, former barista, worked harder than he ever had in his life. He saved every dollar, ate just enough to survive, and never complained. And for the first time, he felt like a better person. But life wasn't done teaching him lessons. Because one day, as he worked in the diner, wiping tables and refilling coffee cups, the door opened, and in walked someone he never expected to see again. The bell above the diner door jingled, and the former barista turned instinctively. His heart stopped. Standing at the entrance, dressed in a tailored suit, was the same mysterious man who had given the homeless man that business card weeks ago. The barista froze, his mind racing. Why is he here? Does he recognize me? The man scanned the diner, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room. When his eyes landed on the barista, he paused, just for a second, before walking over and taking a seat in one of the booths. The barista swallowed hard. He definitely remembers me. But he had no choice. This was his job now. So, with shaky hands, he grabbed a menu and walked up to the table. "Good afternoon, sir. What can I get for you?" His voice was steady, but inside, his nerves were on fire. The man studied him. Really studied him. Finally, he spoke. "You used to work at the cafe on 5th Street, didn't you?" The barista clenched his jaw. There was no point in lying. "Yeah. Not anymore." The man nodded. "I know." Silence stretched between them. The barista shifted uncomfortably, gripping the notepad in his hand. Then, the man asked a question that made his stomach drop. "Do you know who that homeless man was?" The barista's throat went dry. Of course, he didn't. But something in the man's tone told him the answer was important. The man leaned forward slightly. He wasn't just any man. He was once one of the wealthiest entrepreneurs in this city. Built an empire from nothing. Then, one mistake cost him everything. The barista's heart pounded. The man continued. He could have recovered. He had connections, money stored away. But instead of taking the easy way out, he chose to walk a different path. The barista frowned. Why? The man gave a small, knowing smile. To see who people really are. The barista's breath caught. To see who people really are. His stomach twisted as memories of that night at the cafe flooded back. The insults. The mockery. The laughter. The test. And he had failed. Miserably. The barista couldn't move, couldn't breathe as the weight of realization settled on him. He had judged a man without knowing his story. He had kicked someone down, never once imagining he'd be in the same place one day. And now, he was sitting across from someone who had watched it all happen. The businessman spoke again. You're different now. The barista blinked. What? You've changed. I can see it. The barista swallowed hard, suddenly feeling exposed. The man picked up the menu, flipping it open. Tell me, Do you still think people like him don't belong in places like this? The barista's chest ached with shame. No, he admitted. I was wrong. For the first time in a long time, he meant it. The businessman nodded. Good. Then, with a small smile, he said something unexpected. Now, let's talk about your future. The barista couldn't believe what he had just heard. My future? The businessman leaned back in his seat, tapping a finger on the menu. Yes. You've learned a hard lesson. But the real question is, what will you do with it? The barista's throat tightened. For weeks, he had struggled. He had lost everything, his job, his home, his dignity. And now, he finally understood. Respect isn't just for those who seem important. It's for everyone. He cleared his throat. I don't expect anything. I don't deserve it. The businessman raised an eyebrow. That's a good start. But tell me, what do you want? The barista hesitated. Before, he had wanted success. Money. Status. Now? He just wanted a chance to prove he wasn't the same person anymore. I want to work. To earn my place. To make things right. The businessman studied him for a long moment, then pulled something from his pocket and slid it across the table. A business card. But this time, it had his name on it. The barista's hands shook as he picked it up. What is this? The businessman smiled. A job offer. Not a handout, an opportunity. If you've truly changed, you'll make something of it. The barista stared at the card, emotions crashing into him all at once. This was his second chance. The kind he never gave others. The next morning, he stepped into an office, one much bigger and grander than the cafe he had once worked in. A receptionist greeted him, already expecting him. Follow me, she said, leading him through the gleaming hallways. His stomach twisted in nervous anticipation. Then, the doors to the main office swung open. And sitting at the desk, waiting for him, was someone he never expected. The homeless man. Except he wasn't homeless anymore. He was dressed in a crisp suit, his posture strong, his presence commanding. The barista's breath caught. Welcome, the man said, smiling. I see you found your way here after all. The barista stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The man he had once mocked, dismissed, and humiliated, was sitting behind a massive desk, in a skyscraper office, overlooking the entire city. He wasn't homeless. He was powerful. The realization hit like a tidal wave. This was a test all along. The man's gaze was calm, patient, but behind it was something else, something that made the barista's stomach churn. Disappointment. The barista's voice cracked. You're not homeless. The man leaned back in his chair. I was. For a time. But not in the way you think. The barista swallowed hard, gripping the business card in his hand. I don't understand. The man smiled slightly. You will. He gestured toward a chair. Sit. The barista hesitated, then slowly lowered himself into the seat. His heart pounded. He had mocked this man. Treated him like he was nothing. And now, he was sitting in front of someone who had the power to change his entire future. The man folded his hands together. Let me tell you a story. The barista nodded slowly, too nervous to speak. The man's voice was steady. Years ago, I was like you. Young, successful, and convinced that people on the streets were there because they deserved it. The barista winced. That had been his exact mindset. Then, one day, I lost everything. The barista's eyebrows furrowed. How? The man exhaled. A business deal went wrong. I trusted the wrong people. My accounts were frozen, assets seized. Just like that, I went from wealth to nothing. The barista felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had thought homelessness was something that only happened to people who didn't work hard. But now, he was looking at proof that life doesn't work that way. The man continued. For months, I lived on the streets. I saw how people looked at me. How they avoided me. How they judged me without knowing my story. He paused, his eyes locking onto the barista's. How people like you treated me. The barista swallowed, his throat dry. He had been one of those people. The man sighed. Eventually, I got back on my feet. I had friends in high places who helped me recover. But the experience changed me. The barista nodded slowly, his hands gripping his knees. That's why you go back. Why you still live like that sometimes. The man's lips curled into a faint smile. I don't just go back. I test people. The barista's stomach dropped. It had been a test. And he had failed. The man leaned forward. The real question is, did you learn anything? The barista clenched his fists. Yes. I did. He took a shaky breath. I was wrong. About everything. About people. About the way I treated you. His voice cracked. I was an arrogant fool, and I regret it. The man studied him for a long moment, as if searching for something deeper. Then, he gave a small nod. Good. That means you're ready. The barista blinked. Ready for what? The man smiled. Your second chance. He slid a folder across the desk. The barista hesitated before picking it up. He flipped it open, and his breath hitched. It was an offer letter. A job. A fresh start. His throat tightened. I don't deserve this. The man nodded. Maybe not. But that's the thing about life, you don't always get what you deserve. Sometimes, you get a chance to be better. The barista exhaled shakily. A chance. A real chance. He looked up at the man, the same man he had once dismissed as worthless, and saw him in a new light. He wasn't just offering a job. He was offering redemption. And this time, the barista wouldn't waste it. The barista stared at the job offer in his hands. It was more than just a piece of paper. It was a second chance. A chance to prove he had changed. A chance to make things right. His throat tightened. Why are you giving me this? The man leaned back in his chair, studying him. Because I believe people can change. I've seen it happen. The barista exhaled shakily, his fingers tightening around the folder. I don't know if I deserve it. The man nodded. Maybe not. But that's not the point. The barista frowned. Then what is? The man's eyes softened. What matters is what you do next. The next morning, the barista stepped into his new workplace. It wasn't a cafe. It wasn't just another job. It was a company dedicated to helping people like him, people who had fallen and needed a way back up. For the first time, he wasn't just working for himself. He was working to give others the same second chance he had been given. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And slowly, he became someone he never thought he could be. Someone better. One evening, as he was closing up the office, he spotted a familiar sight through the glass doors. A young man, arrogant, confident, mocking an older homeless man who had just asked for a little kindness. The scene was painfully familiar. The barista stepped outside, his heart pounding. He had been that guy. Now, he had the chance to make sure someone else didn't repeat his mistake. Walking up to the young man, he placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You have no idea who you're talking to. But trust me, You'll regret this." The young man scoffed and walked away. The homeless man looked up, surprised. "Why did you step in?" The barista smiled softly. "Because once upon a time, someone did the same for me." The man nodded, as if he understood. "You're a good man." The barista exhaled. "Not always. But I'm trying." And for the first time in his life, he meant it.